crowbar struck marble at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The sound echoed across the plaza like a gunshot, sharp, violent, final. A crack spiderwebbed across the Virgin Mary's face, splitting her serene expression from forehead to chin. Ethan Rowe laughed. He actually laughed, head thrown back, crowbar still raised, while the crowd behind him gasped in horror. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that within 72 hours he would see that face again, and this time she would be looking back. If you think there are no consequences for mocking what others hold sacred, if you believe the universe operates on pure chance and nothing more, then you need to hear what happened to the man who destroyed a statue that had stood for 127 years. Ethan Rowe was the kind of atheist who made it everyone's problem, not the quiet, live and let live type who simply didn't believe. No, Ethan was a missionary for disbelief, armed with condescension and a collection of tired arguments he'd absorbed from internet forums and celebrity scientists. At 38 years old, he'd built a successful contracting business in Mesilla, New Mexico, demolishing old structures and building new ones. He liked to say he was literally tearing down the past to make room for the future. His truck bore a bumper sticker: "Science flies, you to the moon. Religion flies, you into buildings." At job sites, when workers made the sign of the cross before operating heavy machinery, Ethan would roll his eyes dramatically. "That's not going to keep the crane from tipping if you don't check the hydraulics," he'd say. "Physics doesn't care about your superstitions." He reserved his sharpest mockery for Catholicism. Something about the statues, the incense, the rituals, it all struck him as particularly absurd. "Grown adults praying to plaster figures," he'd say at the bar, where contractors gathered after work. "It's like Santa Claus for people afraid of dying." His crew learned to ignore him. Most were Catholic themselves, second or third generation Mexican Americans for whom faith wasn't a debate topic but a lived inheritance. They crossed themselves anyway. They wore their scapulars under their work shirts. They tolerated Ethan's mockery because he paid well and the work was steady. But tolerance has limits. In March 2023, Ethan won a demolition contract for the old convent of the Sacred Heart, a mission-style building on the edge of Mesilla that had stood since 1896. The archdiocese was selling the property. Maintenance had become impossible. The building was structurally unsound, and the 3 remaining sisters who'd lived there had moved to a newer facility. The land would be developed into a small shopping plaza. The contract was straightforward: demolish everything except the chapel, which would be preserved as a historical landmark, and one other requirement, written explicitly in the agreement: the statue of Our Lady in the courtyard must be carefully removed and transported intact to San Albino Church. The statue was remarkable, a 7-foot-tall marble figure of the Virgin Mary, carved in Italy in 1896, and shipped to New Mexico at enormous expense by the convent's founder, Mother Lucia Martinez. For 127 years it had stood in the courtyard, weathered but unbowed, while generations of sisters prayed before it. The marble had developed a patina that made it seem to glow at certain times of day. Locals called it Our Lady of Mesilla, and credited it with everything from healing sick children to protecting the town from a wildfire in 1957. Ethan looked at it and saw a lawn ornament. "You want me to bubble wrap this thing and hire a specialty crane?" he said to Father Thomas Herrera during the contract meeting. "That'll cost an extra 15 grand, easy." Father Herrera, a patient man in his 60s who dealt with difficult contractors before, nodded. "The statue has immense spiritual value to this community. It's worth the expense." "Spiritual value," Ethan repeated, smirking. He glanced at his assistant, Jake Martinez, who looked uncomfortable. "Jake, how much does spiritual value weigh? Will that strain the crane capacity?" Jake didn't laugh. Neither did Father Herrera. "Mr. Rowe," the priest said carefully, "I understand you may not share our beliefs, but I ask that you respect what this statue represents to people who've prayed before it their entire lives." Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Father, with all respect, and I mean actual respect, not the religious kind where you say bless your heart, but mean something else. It's a statue, a very old, very heavy, very expensive to move statue. I'll do my best, but if it cracks during transport, that's not divine judgment. That's physics and old marble." The meeting ended tensely. Father Herrera left with a knot in his stomach, already knowing this wouldn't end well. Sister Agnes Moreno, 79 years old and a resident of the convent for 51 years, heard about the contractor's attitude from Father Herrera. She'd prayed before that statue every morning since 1972. She'd seen it weather storms, survive earthquakes, endure the desert sun. To her, the statue wasn't just marble, it was a portal through which prayers ascended and grace descended. "He doesn't understand," she told the priest, her voice trembling. "He thinks it's just stone. He doesn't know she's been listening all these years." "I'll supervise the removal personally," Father Herrera assured her. "It will be protected." But both of them felt a cold dread settling in their chests. The demolition began on April 3rd, a Tuesday morning bright with New Mexico sunshine. Ethan's crew arrived early, 2 bulldozers, a backhoe, and a team of 6 workers. The plan was simple: systematically dismantle the convent building while leaving the chapel and courtyard statue untouched. At the end of the project, a specialty moving company would handle the statue. By noon, sections of the convent's east wing had been reduced to rubble. The crew broke for lunch, and Ethan walked through the courtyard toward his truck. He paused before the Virgin Mary statue, squinting up at her serene face. She was beautiful, even he could admit that. The sculptor had captured something ethereal. The slight downward tilt of her head, the gentle curve of her outstretched hands, the folds of her robes that seemed to move in an invisible breeze. Her eyes, though made of stone, seemed to hold a depth that unnerved him. "What are you looking at?" he muttered, then immediately felt foolish for talking to a statue. Jake approached, lunch cooler in hand. "Boss, the guys want to say a prayer before we start the afternoon shift. You know, for safety." Ethan sighed. "Jake, we say a prayer to OSHA regulations and proper equipment checks. That's what keeps people safe." "Humour them. It takes 2 minutes." The crew gathered in the shade of the chapel, removing their hard hats. They recited the Our Father in Spanish, their voices blending in a rhythm that came from childhood memory. Ethan stood apart, checking his phone, making it clear through body language that he wasn't participating in their superstition. Sister Agnes appeared at the courtyard gate, leaning on her cane. She'd come to watch over the statue, unable to stay away. Her presence made the workers more careful, more respectful, but it seemed to annoy Ethan. "Sister," he called out, walking toward her. "You don't need to supervise. We're professionals." "I'm not supervising," she replied quietly. "I'm praying. Well, pray from home. It's a construction site, insurance liability and all that." Sister Agnes's eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp, fixed on him. "That statue has stood here longer than you've been alive, Mr. Rowe, longer than most buildings in this town. It has witnessed prayers from women who've given their lives to service. It deserves respect." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's marble, sister. It doesn't deserve anything. It's an object. To you, perhaps. But to those of us with eyes to see—" "There's nothing to see." Ethan's voice rose, startling even himself. "It's rock-carved to look like a person who probably never existed, or if she did, was just an ordinary woman from 2,000 years ago. This hole," he gestured at the statue. "Worship of plaster and stone is exactly what's wrong with religion. You're praying to artwork." Sister Agnes didn't argue. She simply bowed her head and began whispering a Hail Mary. Something about her refusal to engage, her retreat into prayer, infuriated Ethan more than argument would have. It felt like dismissal, like she pitied him. He turned away, jaw clenched, and saw his crew watching the exchange with uncomfortable expressions. "Back to work," he snapped. "We're burning daylight. The accident happened 3 days later, on Friday afternoon. The crew was demolishing the convent's second floor when a support beam compromised by age and decay gave way unexpectedly. 2 workers were on a scaffold that buckled from the sudden shift. They fell 12 feet, landing hard on debris. One worker, Miguel Santos, broke his ankle. The other, Carlos Ruiz, suffered a concussion. Both were rushed to the hospital. OSHA was called. Work stopped immediately, pending investigation. The crew stood in shocked silence as the ambulance pulled away. Jake found Ethan in the office trailer, head in his hands. "Boss, you okay?" "We checked those beams. We did the structural analysis. How did we miss that?" Jake shrugged helplessly. "Sometimes things just fail." But as they walked back to the site, Jake glanced at the Virgin statue, still standing serene in the courtyard. He couldn't shake the thought that had been growing since the confrontation with Sister Agnes. Maybe we weren't meant to be here. The Osher inspector cleared them to resume work on Monday, ruling the beam failure an unavoidable structural defect, but Miguel and Carlos both refused to return. "Bad energy," Miguel said from his hospital bed. "I felt it all week, like we were being watched." Ethan needed to replace 2 skilled workers in the middle of a contracted timeline. The delays were costing him money. His mood soured further. By Wednesday, April 12th, tensions had reached a breaking point. The replacement workers he'd hired were slower, less experienced. The demolition was behind schedule. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly with calls from the development company pressuring him to speed things up, and through it all the statue stood there, watching, judging. At least that's how it felt to Ethan, though he'd never have admitted it. That afternoon he made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life. The specialty moving company he'd contracted to transport the statue had sent a quote: $22,000 for proper equipment, insurance, and expert handling. The development company balked at the cost. "Find another way," they told Ethan, "or eat the expense yourself." Ethan stood in the courtyard, staring at the Virgin Mary with growing resentment. This hunk of marble was costing him money, time, and patience. His crew tiptoed around it like it might explode. Sister Agnes showed up daily to pray before it, her presence a silent reproach. The whole thing had become a symbol of everything he hated about religion: expense without value, reverence without reason, superstition masquerading as virtue. "I'll move it myself," he announced to Jake. "We've got the equipment, I'll be careful, but I'm not paying 22 grand to bubble wrap a lawn ornament." Jake's face went pale. "Boss, the contract says move it intact to San Albino. It doesn't specify the moving company. I'm a licensed contractor with bonded equipment. It's legal." "It's not about legal. It's about what?" Offending the invisible sky wizard. "Jake, I'm disappointed. You're smarter than this." But Jake wasn't thinking about God. He was thinking about Sister Agnes's warning, about Miguel's broken ankle, about the feeling that had been building all week that they were tampering with something better left alone. "At least wait until Father Herrera can be present," Jake pleaded. Out of respect, Ethan checked his watch. "It's 3:30. I'm not waiting for permission to move property I'm contractually responsible for. Get the crane ready." Word spread fast. By the time Ethan positioned the crane, a small crowd had gathered outside the courtyard fence. Parishioners who'd heard what was happening, curious teenagers with phones ready, workers from neighbouring sites. Someone called Father Herrera, someone else called Sister Agnes. Ethan ignored them all. He'd brought his smallest crane, a 15-ton unit that could handle the statue's weight easily. He positioned it carefully, studying the statue's base and centre of gravity. He wasn't reckless. Whatever else could be said about him, Ethan was a skilled professional who understood physics and structural engineering. He attached the straps, checked the connections twice, and signalled to his crane operator. The crowd watched in tense silence. The statue lifted smoothly. For a moment, everything was perfect. The marble Virgin rising gracefully into the air, her outstretched arms seeming to embrace the sky. The crane swung slowly, preparing to load her onto the flatbed truck. Then a strap slipped. Later, the equipment company would confirm that the strap was properly rated and installed correctly. The slippage had no mechanical explanation, but slip it did, and the statue tilted violently to one side. The crane operator, panicking, overcorrected. The statue swung hard, smashing into the courtyard stone pillar. The impact was sickening, marble striking stone with a crack that seemed to split the air itself. The Virgin's face, that serene expression that had comforted thousands of prayers, shattered. Chunks of carved marble fell to the ground. Her right arm broke off at the elbow. When the crane finally lowered what remained to the ground, the statue was unrecognizable. A mutilated torso with half a face. The crowd erupted. Women wailed. Men cursed in Spanish. Someone screamed, "Sacrilegio!" Sister Agnes, who had just arrived in time to witness the destruction, collapsed. 2 parishioners caught her before she hit the ground. She wasn't unconscious. Worse, she was conscious and sobbing, staring at the broken marble with an expression of such profound grief. It was unbearable to witness. Father Herrera knelt in the rubble, picking up fragments of the Virgin's face with trembling hands. And Ethan Rowe, standing amid the devastation, with dust settling around him like fallout, with a crowd of furious believers surrounding him, with the weight of what he'd just done settling on his shoulders, laughed. It wasn't a laugh of humour, it was the laugh of someone whose worldview had just been validated, whose contempt had been proven justified. It was the laugh of a man who'd spent years arguing that sacred objects had no power, and here was the proof, a holy statue shattered by simple physics, unable to save itself, unable to strike him down, unable to do anything except break like any other lump of rock. "You see?" he shouted at the crowd, his voice carrying an edge of hysteria. "You see? It's just stone. It can't protect itself because there's nothing in it. No spirit, no power, no—" "Get out!" Father Herrera's voice was quiet, but cut through Ethan's rant like a blade. "Father, I'm sorry for the accident, but this proves—" "Get out!" The priest's face was terrible to behold. Not angry, but filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. "You've done enough. Leave this place. Now." The crowd parted as Ethan walked to his truck. Their eyes followed him, not with anger, but with something worse. Pity. As if they knew something he didn't. As if they were watching a man who'd just sentenced himself to something he couldn't comprehend. Teenagers had filmed the whole thing. By sunset, the video was everywhere. Ethan laughing in the dust, the broken virgin at his feet. Sister Agnes collapsed in grief. The caption on TikTok, "Atheist destroys sacred statue and mocks believers." Within hours, it had 1 million views. The comments section was a war zone. "He's cursed now, just wait." This is why God sends people to hell. As an atheist myself, this guy's a disgrace. Have some basic human respect. Science can't save him from what's coming. I give him 3 days before something happens. Ethan read them all that night, alone in his house, drinking beer, and feeling something he refused to name as guilt. He typed angry responses, arguing with strangers, defending his actions, insisting it was an accident, and their superstitious reactions proved his point about religious hysteria. But when he finally turned off his phone and lay in bed in the darkness, he couldn't stop seeing Sister Agnes's face. The grief, the betrayal, the way she'd looked at the broken marble as if watching a murder. It's just a statue, he told himself, just carved rock. Nothing more. His dog, Ranger, a German shepherd who usually slept at the foot of the bed, was whining at the bedroom door, scratching to be let out. Ethan got up, annoyed, and opened the door. Ranger wouldn't leave. He stood in the doorway, hackles raised, growling at something in the hallway. The hallway was empty. Ethan turned on the light. Nothing there. "What's wrong with you?" he muttered, but Ranger backed away, still growling, and refused to enter the bedroom. Ethan left the door open and returned to bed, but he didn't sleep well. His dreams were fragmented and strange, filled with the sound of marble cracking, with dust that tasted like tears, with the sensation of being watched by eyes he couldn't see. When he woke at 3:17 a.m., a time he would later note with superstitious dread he didn't want to admit, the house was silent except for Ranger's continued low growl from the living room, and on his nightstand, placed carefully next to his phone, was a piece of marble he didn't remember bringing home, a shard from the Virgin's broken face, including one carved eye. Still watching, Ethan stared at the marble fragment, his rational mind spinning. He must have picked it up accidentally, he decided. It must have been in his pocket, fallen out when he undressed. There was no other explanation, except he distinctly remembered leaving the site without touching the rubble. Remembered Father Herrera gathering the fragments himself, cradling them like broken children. Remembered walking directly to his truck, hands empty. He picked up the marble eye, turning it over. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, up close. The iris delicately carved with lines radiating from the pupil, the slight curve of the cornea, even a hint of the tear duct. It was almost alive. Ethan threw it in the trash and went back to bed. The next morning, it was on his bathroom sink. He stood there, toothbrush frozen halfway to his mouth, staring at the marble fragment sitting exactly where he'd left his phone the night before. His heart hammered. He'd definitely thrown it away. He remembered the sound of it hitting the bottom of the trash can. "Ranger!" he called out, though he knew the dog couldn't have retrieved it from the covered can. Ethan picked it up again, fighting down a surge of irrational fear. He walked outside and threw it over his back fence into the scrubland beyond his property. Threw it hard enough that it disappeared into the brush. At work, the crew was subdued. They'd all seen the video, read the comments, felt the weight of what had happened. Jake pulled Ethan aside before the morning meeting. "Boss, people are talking. Half the crew wants to quit. They think the job is cursed now. Cursed, Ethan repeated flatly. Because I broke a statue? Because you laughed while doing it. There's video of you laughing, man. While Sister Agnes was crying on the ground. That's... Jake struggled for words. That's not okay. Even if you don't believe, that's not how you treat people's grief. The words hit harder than Ethan wanted to admit. It was shock, he said, though he wasn't sure that was true. Nervous laughter? I didn't mean... Doesn't matter what you meant. That's how it looked. The morning proceeded badly. Equipment malfunctioned. A worker cut his hand on twisted rebar and needed stitches. A delivery of materials came 3 hours late. By lunch, Ethan's carefully planned schedule had collapsed into chaos, and he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept drifting to the marble eye, to the way Ranger had growled at nothing, to the strange dreams he couldn't quite remember, but which left him with a feeling of dread. His phone buzzed, a text from the development company. Have you seen the news? This video is causing us problems. Corporate wants a statement. Ethan checked the local news site. The story had gone regional. Contractor destroys historic statue, mocks grieving community. His face was plastered across the article, captured mid-laugh, with the broken virgin visible behind him. Public opinion was unanimous and brutal. He was being called everything from cultural vandal to anti-Catholic bigot. The mayor released a statement condemning the incident. The archdiocese was considering legal action for breach of contract and destruction of irreplaceable religious property. Ethan's business phone started ringing with cancellations. 3 upcoming contracts terminated with vague language about philosophical differences and community standards. His insurance company called to inform him they were investigating the incident and might not cover the damages. In 6 hours, he'd gone from successful contractor to pariah. That night, drinking alone in his house, Ethan tried to muster the righteous anger he'd felt at the job site, tried to convince himself he was the victim of religious hysteria, that this proved everything he'd always said about believers being irrational and vindictive. But the anger wouldn't come, just exhaustion and something uncomfortably close to shame. Ranger was still acting strange, refusing to enter certain rooms, whining at walls. Ethan was about to take him to the vet when he saw it. The marble eye, sitting on his coffee table. He'd thrown it into the scrubland that morning. He was certain, absolutely certain, but there it was. The carved iris seeming to catch the lamplight, seeming to follow him as he moved around the room. This isn't happening, Ethan said aloud. This is stress. I'm stressed and not thinking clearly. He grabbed the marble fragment, walked to his truck, and drove 15 miles into the desert. He dug a hole 3 feet deep with a camping shovel and buried the eye, covering it with rocks and dirt. Then he drove home, refusing to acknowledge the sick feeling in his stomach. The next morning, Sunday, April the 16th, Ethan woke to Ranger barking frantically. He stumbled out of bed to find the dog in the kitchen, hackles raised, barking at the counter. The marble eye sat on the cutting board, next to Ethan's coffee maker. His hands trembled as he picked it up. This wasn't possible. This violated every law of physics and rationality he'd built his worldview on. Objects didn't move themselves. Buried things didn't return. The universe operated on predictable principles, and those principles didn't include marble fragments that refused to stay discarded. Ethan sat heavily at his kitchen table, at the eye in his palm. He tried to think of rational explanations. Someone was gaslighting him, playing an elaborate prank. Maybe Jake, trying to teach him a lesson. Maybe angry parishioners who'd gotten his address from the company website. But none of those explanations felt right. The doors were locked. His security system showed no breaches, and the eye kept appearing in places only he would see. His nightstand, his bathroom, his truck's cup holder. Places where it would be waiting when he was alone. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Rowe was afraid. Sunday night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in his living room with every light on, the marble eye placed on the coffee table where he could watch it. Ranger had given up barking and now simply huddled behind the couch, shaking. Ethan's mind raced through everything he knew about psychology, neurology, stress-induced hallucination. He must be having some kind of breakdown. The business losses, the social shaming, the guilt he wouldn't acknowledge. It was manifesting as this delusion about a mobile, marble fragment. At 2:47 a.m, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She sees you. Ethan's blood went cold. He didn't respond, But more texts followed. You struck her face. You laughed at her children's grief. Now she watches. Who is this? He typed back, hands shaking. No response. He tried calling the number. Disconnected. Ethan threw his phone across the room and stood pacing. This was harassment. He'd call the police. The lights went out. All of them, simultaneously, though the house was on multiple circuits. Ethan stood frozen in darkness so complete it felt solid. His breath came quick and shallow. Ranger whimpered. Then, in the darkness, a sound. Quiet at first, almost like wind chimes. No, not chimes. Like small objects rolling on wood. Multiple objects from multiple directions. Ethan fumbled for his phone's flashlight. Found it. The beam cut through the darkness, and what he saw made his knees buckle. Marble fragments, dozens of them scattered across his living room floor. Small pieces of carved stone, none bigger than a quarter. They hadn't been there minutes before. They couldn't have been. He'd been sitting right here. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the fragments were moving, rolling slowly across the floor, drawn together by invisible force, gathering in the centre of the room, clicking against each other with that wind chime sound. They were forming a pattern, a shape, an M, for Mary. Ethan screamed. Actually screamed, the sound tearing from his throat like something animal and primal. He backed against the wall, phone lights shaking wildly as the marble fragments continued their impossible assembly. The lights snapped back on. The fragments were gone. The floor was clear, but the marble eye on the coffee table had rolled onto its side, and in the lamplight the carved iris seemed wet, as if weeping. Ethan ran to his truck and drove. Didn't know where, didn't care. Just drove through the empty night streets of Mesilla with tears streaming down his face, his entire understanding of a reality crumbling like the statue he'd destroyed. He ended up at the construction site. The courtyard was lit by a single security lamp, casting long shadows across the rubble. The convent was half demolished, its gutted walls stark against the night sky, and in the centre of the courtyard, where the Virgin Mary had stood for 127 years, there was only a dark stain on the flagstones where her base had been. Ethan walked to the spot, drawn by something he couldn't name. The rubble had been cleared away. Father Herrera had insisted on gathering every fragment, determined to see if the statue could somehow be restored. The ground was swept clean, except for one thing, a single white rose, fresh and perfect, lying exactly where the Virgin's feet had stood. No one had been here. The site was locked, secured. There were no rose bushes anywhere nearby. Yet the rose was real. Ethan could smell its perfume, impossibly sweet in the desert night. He knelt beside it, and something inside him broke. All the arguments, all the certainty, all the smug superiority he'd carried for years, it crumbled. Not because he suddenly believed in God, or miracles, or the supernatural, but because he finally understood something more fundamental. It didn't matter what was true. What mattered was what he'd done. He'd destroyed something people loved. He'd laughed at their grief. He'd treated their sacred symbol with contempt and their pain with mockery. Whether the statue was just marble or something more was irrelevant. His cruelty was real. Their suffering was real, and he had caused it. Ethan picked up the rose with trembling hands. It was so beautiful it hurt to look at, so fragile and perfect that holding it felt like holding all the damage he'd done, made manifest. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty courtyard, to the absent statue, to the people he'd hurt. "I'm so sorry." The night air was still. No response came because statues don't speak, and prayers aren't answered with audible voices, and the universe doesn't rearrange itself to validate anyone's worldview. But Ethan felt something shift anyway. Not outside himself, but within. A loosening of the hard shell he'd built around his heart, the armour of certainty and contempt. It cracked, and through the cracks, something unexpected flowed in. Humility. He didn't know what he believed anymore. Didn't know if the marble eye had really moved, or if his mind had conjured it from guilt and stress. Didn't know if the rose was miracle or coincidence. But he knew he'd been wrong. Not about God necessarily, about people, about respect, about the difference between disagreement and cruelty. Headlights suddenly flooded the courtyard. A car pulled up. Father Herrera's old sedan. The priest stepped out, moving slowly, looking utterly exhausted. "Mr. Rowe," he said quietly, "I thought I might find you here." "How?" "One of the neighbours called, said someone was at the site." Father Herrera approached, saw the rose in Ethan's hands. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise? Recognition? Where did you find that? It was just here, where the statue stood. The priest nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. There's something you should know, Mr. Rowe. The statue, Our Lady of Mesilla, was commissioned in 1896 by Mother Lucia Martinez after she survived a deadly fever. In her delirium, she claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to her and told her she would recover. When she did, she had this statue carved and placed it in the courtyard. For 127 years, people have reported roses appearing in this spot during times of great prayer. White roses, like this one, even in winter, even in drought. The last time was 3 years ago, when Sister Agnes's brother was dying of cancer. She prayed here all night, and in the morning there was a white rose. Ethan's hands tightened on the rose. That's just coincidence, or someone planting them. Perhaps. Father Herrera's tone held no challenge, no need to convince. But Sister Agnes's brother made a full recovery. The doctors called it remarkable. They stood in silence, the priest and the atheist, in a ruined courtyard under a vast sky full of stars that cared nothing for human certainty or doubt. Finally, Ethan spoke. I need to make this right. I don't know how, but I need to try. Why? Father Herrera's question was genuine. You don't believe. Why does it matter to you? Because I hurt people, because I was cruel, because... Ethan's voice broke. Because I laughed while your community grieved, and that makes me a monster, regardless of what I believe about God. Father Herrera studied him for a long moment. Then, come to the church tomorrow. We'll talk about restitution. The news that Ethan Rowe had approached Father Herrera spread quickly through Mesilla's Catholic community. Some saw it as a publicity stunt, others as sincere repentance. Most were simply weary of the whole ordeal. Sister Agnes was sceptical. The Blessed Mother may forgive him, she said, but I can't. You're not bitter, Father Herrera replied gently, but maybe justice isn't punishment. Maybe it's something else. Ethan arrived at the rectory dishevelled, holding the white rose from the site. I don't know how to fix what I broke, he said. Start with the truth, the priest replied. Ethan confessed everything. The corporate pressure, his resentment, his cruel laughter. I thought I'd proved that sacred things had no power, he admitted, but I only proved how small I was. Father Herrera listened quietly. What changed? Ethan hesitated. I saw Sister Agnes's face. I realized I'd destroyed more than stone. The priest explained plans for a new bronze statue, $75,000 to commission. Ethan agreed to fund it entirely. It's not generosity, he said. It's restitution. Over the next weeks, Ethan worked tirelessly at the site, unpaid. The community slowly thawed. Sister Agnes, though, stayed away. Jake, his foreman, noticed the change. You're different. I'm broken, Ethan replied, trying to figure out how much. The sculptor, Maria Castellanos, interviewed townspeople. And Ethan? What did you see in the statue? She asked. An obstacle, he said. Now I'd see someone's mother. A century of prayers. 6 months later, on the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the new bronze Virgin was unveiled before hundreds. Her robes bore engraved names and prayers. The crowd wept. Before the blessing, Father Herrera invited Ethan to speak. I can't undo what I did, Ethan said, voice trembling. But I've learned that even if I don't share your faith, what you believe matters. And I treated that with contempt. I'm sorry. He turned to Sister Agnes. I mocked what you loved. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I ask anyway. Later, as people prayed at the new statue, Sister Agnes approached him. You hurt me, she said softly. But holding on to anger is hurting me more. Mercy isn't about what's deserved. It's about love. So I forgive you. Ethan took her hand. The old nun and the repentant skeptic stood together, silent under the gaze of the new Virgin Mary, the embodiment of loss, forgiveness, and grace.